Emma River Roberts, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Before we discuss the kind of Working Class Climate Alliance and the main issues around the lack of working class perspectives within the climate movement, I'd love to know a little bit more about you.
Sure. So I've always been an anti-capitalist before I've realised, and I think a lot of that comes from growing up as working class. But the final, I think, turning point for me, sort of questioning it to really just going, actually, we need to do something about this, was losing my job as an archaeologist because of the impacts of the 2008 recession. And I was only able to find stable work in finance. And despite them making like all this money, myself and others were only ever being paid like actual poverty wages. And then on top of that, and this was like the final launch off, as I witnessed what I thought to be the large-scale active facilitation of money laundering in the industry. And this was some of, the richest, most powerful people in the world. But after a 2.5-year investigation, sort of going down the whistleblowing route, I was told that, there's nothing to see, no one did anything wrong. So I'm obviously legally compelled at this point to say, what did I know? Totally got all that wrong. And I think sort of from that, I realized that like no one was coming for us. And I was like, if there's ever going to be sort of any empirical change, it's going to be us that has to push it through because no one's looking out for us. So it really did. My work with like the climate and the economy really came in from that economic marginalization point.
How does that link into your work on the climate? How did you kind of draw that connection between these kind of nefarious dealings in financial services to what's happening in the climate?
So it kind of pushed me into thinking like, you read about activism, but at the time I kind of didn't know anyone who was doing it. And then it was just at the point where XR were, really taken off. And although at the time, I think we're going back about 6 or 7 years now, they really weren't focusing on it. To me, I saw it as a form of injustice anyway. So I think I sort of got involved sort of with that naturally. And I was working very closely with the Stop HS2 sort of team, which I appreciate got really criticised by people in the North because they said that, we need the trains. So I do backtrack on sort of my stance on that now. But from that sort of approach to the climate, as well as from the HS2 guys about sort of the economic disparity, that ended up sort of aligning my thinking towards like more climate goals.
So was that the catalyst for starting that organisation?
No. I mean, it's been building up for years, but it was actually the Beyond Growth Conference at the European Parliament last year. Class just wasn't on the agenda. In conversations with people, there were still these stereotypes about the working class and far right floating around. And even with the best of intentions, you can tell that people's alignment is so sort of off where they really should be. And when myself and others were talking, we had people from the Global South feeling that they weren't very represented at all. It became really apparent that there's no space for us to discuss these issues. So I thought, well, I need to create a space. And that's where it really sort of came out from.
I mean, that conference was the kind of, it's the biggest ever post-growth conference that happened. It was at the European Commission. It had all of the kind of faces and names that you would expect to be speaking at that. Was there anything that came out of that you thought was positive?
I thought was good. And even though class kind of wasn't really there, there was still a trade union presence. Even though it's marginal, it's like we know it's there. We know it's possible. And I felt that was incredible to see from the start. As well as I sat through sort of a panel discussion with Tim Jackson about needing to centre sort of care more into the economy. And I think with all policy making decisions, it can be very abstract, quite cold. They just look at people with statistics. So for me, that was, again, very significant because we're kind of humanizing policies, which I think we really need to do a lot more.
That catalyst was seeing what was going on in the post-growth movement and wanting to ensure there was that working class voice. Before we get into the details of that, I just quite like summary from you to give our audience your perception of the challenges that we face when it comes to the climate. You know, we're in 2024 now. Let's look towards like the end of the decade. Certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important decade we've ever had as we face this potential climate catastrophe. What are the challenges ahead, Emma?
For me, it is, especially amongst the working class, it's depreciating living standards for many reasons, but also because it's a significant factor behind people voting for the right and the far right, because they're doing such a good job of tapping into people's immediate needs and saying, you know, well, you know, the Greens want to, you know, give you these heat pumps, which is going to cost you money, whereas we're going to, you know, insulate your housing. And especially in Europe, for example, but also elsewhere, Scotland, England, basically most places, when it comes to people voting for the right, they don't necessarily correlate with their attitudes towards the environment. You can have people actually sort of completely believing what's going on, but they ended up voting for very illiberal parties because what they're doing is they're tapping into these day-to-day habits and saying, this is going to happen in the future, but we're here for you now. If that makes sense.
Yeah. It's focusing on the kind of principal primary concerns, isn't it? That the right seems to be doing in a way that the left just isn't really able to articulate.
You're exactly right. And the problem with the left historically, and it continues, is that they're a bit too logical in their approach, because a lot of them are of the professional class, and you're trained to think around sort of like rationale and logic, and you know, if we give you all the statistics and stuff, you know, what we're saying makes sense. And it's difficult to connect with people emotionally if you're only sort of offering them these sort of graphs and stuff. But you can't empower people through statistics. You can't build relationships through, you know, all these documents and stuff. And what we really need to see from the left, which they're not doing as much, we are seeing a rise, is more on the ground sort of formations, but for it to be visible. So we need people of all stages to be sort of talking about this and to show, oh, we're actually building alliances here. You say we're the woke liberal elite, but actually no, because we're working with these working class communities sort of here. Yeah.
And how important do you think the next few years are? Let's say kind of, you know, I'll ask you about the impending Labour administration next, but, you know, from 24 to 2029, how important do you think this period of time is for, you know, a survivable planet?
Absolutely fundamental. So the World Economic Forum, they've said that in the next 2 years, it's going to be misinformation and misleading information. That's sort of the biggest sort of social risk to us all. And what really concerns me is that where we've got this increasingly disenfranchised population, not just with the working class, but middle class people as well, you know, the media is just going to hone in on this and saying, you know, well, there's nothing to be worried about, you know, the left are the enemy. And where we don't have as much of a coalescence between the working class and middle class groups as we should have, I'm just worried these relations are going to sort of go further and further apart. And instead, I think of mobilizing around specific policy goals. I think the first thing we need to be doing is mobilizing around building solidarity and getting sort of to know each other as people, because we're going to need it, because we're going to fail, and we need to learn how to struggle and fail and to sort of move on from that time and time again. And you can't do that unless sort of you know and trust the people that you're around.
Yeah. Have we got anything to look forward to with a new Labour administration across the UK?
No.
Okay, right, let's move on.
So, I mean, you know, I think the fact that Unite didn't endorse the manifesto really says it all. The big Labour union, you know, they refused to scrap fire and hire 0 hours contracts. However, what I have noticed, and this is really promising, it's a little bit late, but this large-scale rejection and disenfranchisement, understandably with Labour, as well as Tory, is fueling support for the Green Party, especially amongst the younger generations. But in Herefordshire, it looks like they're up for a historic moment. The Tories have held the seat for over about 100 years, and the polls are showing that the Greens could actually get in. And if this happens, you know, Herefordshire's a big farming community. And although we're like really late in terms of getting votes, because that would end up going to the next sort of elections, if the candidate in Herefordshire is able to actually build those relationships with our agricultural workers, I think personally that would go just completely off the charts in terms of building alliances with the working class and sort of our workers, because they're showing, well, actually, no, we can work together. And these green policies will benefit us.
We're maybe looking past the Labour administration to find any green shoots and looking towards the Green Party. That's in the UK. I know you spent a little bit of time in Scotland last week. I think you were up for a conference in Glasgow. For our audience, you know, a lot of them who are Scottish and we're looking at Holyrood, what's your perception as a working class English person to what we're doing in Scotland when it comes to the climate? Can you see any differences, similarities? Are we better? Are we worse? I'd love to hear your view on that.
So it's my first time in Glasgow, and the one thing I noticed straight away was how much greenery there is. And it does so much sort of for your well-being, because I was walking like my friends were taking me past some parts of Glasgow that economically are a little deprived, but they were covered in greenery. And although, of course, that doesn't pay your bills, it doesn't insulate your housing. It's much better than it is here. We're like concrete jungles sometimes. So I don't know if that sounds almost like a little bit frivolous, but that really stood out for me, especially like in London.
Yeah. Scotland plants up until the last couple of years before COVID, but Scotland plants more trees than the rest of the UK combined. So you saw that when you came to the city. I'm going to, when this goes out later, I'm going to put up this image now. This is the provisional plan for George Street in Edinburgh. And you'll just see how completely lacking it is of any kind of tree and canopy cover. And when you came up to Glasgow, you noticed it was better than London. But I'm moving back from Barcelona. Barcelona has something like 45,000 trees. Barcelona has a city tree strategy that it's had for a quarter of a century. So the difference between these kind of European cities that we should aspire to and where we are in the UK is just miles apart. And we just never see a tree for all of the wonderful things it can kind of give, you know, as you said, well-being, but canopy cover and helping with pollution as well as carbon capture and the visual limit. We just never really see that. We're so kind of caught in this concrete junk. But what about the kind of policy space in Scotland? Did you get a sense that it was more or less progressive when it came to climate issues?
So I found it was sort of much more progressive, and from speaking with people there, they were sort of tying in absolutely everything with the climate, because the Scottish have introduced the biggest single anti sort of poverty measure in the form of a payment. I can't remember how much.
Yeah. I think £25 a week. I think we pay to kind of get over the 2-child cap that's across the UK. Yeah.
And, you know, people were saying to me, because the people I was at the conference with, they're all benefiting from it. And they're saying it's not just meeting sort of our sort of immediate needs, but it's also allowing us sort of to buy foods we may not have been able to buy beforehand, because, you know, they were saying all we can afford is sort of this pre-packaged frozen stuff. But now we can bring in more stuff that's sort of local to where we live. We know it's better for sort of the environment, it's better for the local economy, and absolutely. And to me, that was really wonderful to see, because the 2-child cap is absolutely cruel, you know, to have in for anyone.
Yeah. Well, you know, in Scotland, I would say there's a lot of organisations who are kind of pushing this progressive economics with this understanding of our ecological constraints and our ecological boundaries. So I hope that there's something for activists like you that can kind of coalesce round in Scotland, where maybe there isn't that to such an extent in the rest of the UK. Well, let's get on to our main topic then, which is this kind of lack of working class voices within the climate movement. Could you just give me a brief kind of overview of why you think this is the case and also what impact it has?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it centres around four main issues. So autonomy, visibility, legitimacy, and class tensions. Because overall, the working class lack the autonomy to influence decision-making processes compared to the middle class. So, for example, like the aims of a movement, the policies and causes to support movement building strategies. And this is due both to like systemic barriers such as time or even social exclusion from classism. And because of this, they don't have the same amount of visibility. Working class environmentalism has always been round, but you can't really see it all the time. Because their efforts go unseen by so many and subsequently unacknowledged, it's often misconstrued as sort of their lack of concern for the environment, so stereotyped as ignorant, which in turn sort of legitimizes some middle class people claiming their space as these legitimate producers and disseminators of knowledge, so they can shape really what constitutes as sort of the correct climate action. So we've seen this historic over focus on carbon footprints, which people are starting to move away from, but it's really sort of damaged relations, all of that. And to me, that's probably the biggest impact at the moment that I'm feeling sort of on the ground, not just across sort of England and Scotland, but outside as well, because a lot of people feel as if they're going to be looked down on by the middle class. You get this unfair stereotyping in return. So saying, you know, oh, they're all just these super virtuous people. And neither side can fully relate to each other. So we've got this quite awkward sort of state of relations between the two. And there's some really great pockets of collaboration. I don't want to say that no one gets on, but overall, you've got this like ambiguity and sort of tensions between the two.
I remember reading a paper about the transition town movement that was kind of early 2000s to kind of late 2000s, I think, in the UK, certainly before I was involved in that type of activism. But the papers were saying it failed because it lacked working class voices. It was like the middle class just talking to themselves. And these movements, if they want to succeed, have got to be much more class embracing and have really got to understand the impact that policies have on different classes. So when we're looking at that kind of class impact, if you're looking at some of the policy suggestions that come from, you know, either the establishment or middle class dominated organizations within the climate movement, what type of solutions do they come up with that you kind of have a truck with? What do they suggest that just doesn't seem like they've had any kind of working class engagement in those policies?
So I think a notorious one's been the heat pumps, and getting people to install solar panels. Because if you rent, you can't install solar panels, and if you own your own house, you probably can't afford it. It's I think it's like at least £5,000, and that's a low estimate. And even though these do have a beneficial sort of impact, I guess in terms of your footprint, the positives are going to outweigh the negatives because people are going to be sort of in economic precarity.
Yeah.
Most people don't really want to ask their landlords for any sort of improvements because if you kick up a fuss, you'll just get evicted over here. So those two have been bad, but also in terms of trying to change how people sort of get around in terms of transport. And they're saying, oh, well, why don't you, take the bus, or why don't you do this? And it's like, we know we shouldn't be driving, but you're not giving us a viable option. Bus prices are going up, train prices are going up, they're delayed. So it's people looking at policies in a too narrow framework without realizing that if you want to garner people's support, you have to give them a viable option already, if that makes sense, rather than saying,
Absolutely.
oh, well, things will get better in the future. No, something has to be better now for people to go for it.
I've got a friend at home, and he works in a glasses manufacturing factory. And he works, like most people who work in factories, a really difficult 40-hour week. And he said to me just a few years ago that basically his whole year is about flying off to Spain for 2 weeks. And that is what he works towards, and just that kind of release and that holiday. And I remember we were speaking about kind of climate, and it was a period when I was studying for my green economy masters and I wasn't flying. And I was speaking to him about it, and he says, do you think I should not fly? And I said, well, I think everyone should cut down. And he said, but it's all that I've got. It's the only thing that I kind of look forward to, is this holiday away for a fortnight. And it really had a big impact on me as someone who's, working class, but could be defined as middle class now. And it's thinking, we've just got no understanding of the impact that some of the good things have. And that when you're working a full-time difficult job, the need for these things. And I think one of the issues is that you look at a lot of policies and people are saying you shouldn't fly, and these things just lack this kind of understanding of what some of these things, how important these things are to certain people. And I think as we look as a climate movement, we should be starting much less. We should have this much less of a broad spread approach to things that you shouldn't do. And we should be going straight to the 1%. And we should be saying there is no such thing as private jets in the UK anymore. Okay. There's no such thing as private yachts in the UK anymore. And we should be targeting the wealthiest in society before we even consider looking at the reduction of consumption, even if that's carbon emissions, by the majority of our society. And there's so much academic research that shows material consumption and emissions are related to wealth. What's your view on this kind of shotgun approach, or should we be much more targeted to those who really are having so much more of the pie than they should have?
So I'm not saying to everyone, like, go flying around everywhere, we should be buying all of this stuff, but I take so many issues with this, I suppose, like politics of less, consuming less, because, all you're saying to the working class is you shouldn't be doing this, this, and this. And as your friend said, that flight is all I've got. And if you look forward to that all year round, and someone's saying to you, the one thing that kind of gives you that escape, that release, something to work towards, I don't know, go camp in a field over there, you're not going to build people's support. And let's face it, if your friend didn't take that flight, is it going to make a dent compared to Taylor Swift flying around everywhere? We need to be going, as you say, after the people who are responsible for most of the emissions. And again, it's how you build that solidarity. And once, in an ideal world, once we get those emissions down, that's when we can hopefully kind of start sorting it out amongst ourselves and going, what shouldn't we consider doing? But yeah, and we know from mainstream approaches to consumption over consumption, it just pisses the working class off, because there's always this moralistic expectation that somebody has the autonomy to do something. And it's expensive. Slow travel is so expensive, getting the train. Somebody recently went to a conference in Spain. They told me that the train there and back cost them €1,000 up from Scotland. So it's quite people can't afford that.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've got to focus on is, as you've highlighted earlier, is the options. And I really feel we have to put so much time and effort in building up these options. And that's what I think cities like Barcelona do, and European cities do so much better than the UK. So to give you an idea, Emma, it's €11.90 for 10 trips on the underground in Barcelona, and you can travel from right across the city for basically just over €1, and you can do that trip. So, and I don't feel that relationship is so obvious in the UK. That's my perception as someone who's coming back to the UK. What's your view as a working class person who's living in the UK at the moment?
Yeah, the options aren't there. I'm so lucky. At the moment, I do most of my work from home. But when I need to get to work, I can never take the bus because I can't rely on it. We don't have like apps to tell us when it's coming. It either turns up or it doesn't. And and the trains are expensive. They're going up. You said it was what, £11 something for 10 trips?
Yeah, €11 for 10 trips on the underground or the tram.
I live 45 minutes away from London, and if I have to get there sort of in peak times, it's going to cost me about £50. So, and that's, you know, I can pay it, not every day, but, you know, for some people, that's what they've got spare for like, what, 2-3 weeks?
Yeah.
It's, we just don't have the options. And I think, well, the shareholders are basically in charge of it, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, it's just to squeeze out profit.
Absolutely. And that's my huge concern about the climate movement in the UK, is that there is a whole focus on what we should not be doing without realizing that you need to give people a viable option, or they will kind of rebel against these changes. And I think that's a really good example. Do you think having more working class voices would help that message be much more clearer and much more effective to those within the, not just the climate movement, but also policymakers?
I think in the climate movement, definitely, because researchers in the social sciences, and as well as personal testimonies, there's a direct correlation between representation and people sort of like you joining a movement. Because when you see somebody who has, who makes you think of you, you go, oh, okay, there's space for people like me there. But it also helps as well because, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and no amount of theory is ever going to replace that lived experience. You know, you can do all the literature reviews that you want, but ultimately it's the person saying what they need. But in terms of like policymakers, yes, it depends. So there's like a running joke between me and a lot of working class people who work in England and actually Scotland as well, is that policymakers, some of them, like to basically roll out sort of this working class perspective, almost as this token. They'll go, oh yeah, this is great, tick box, and they won't take our recommendations. So I think sometimes, I do find that working class people are at times still tokenized in the professional sector, but there are very passionate people out there trying to change it. So hopefully we'll see things go for the better. But it's much more of a struggle in the professional sector.
I read the article that you wrote, and one of the things you kind of mentioned was your decision to kind of de-engage with the degrowth movement. And I think you delivered a presentation at that event in Glasgow you spoke about. I've actually included a link in the comments, so I'd encourage people to read it. I think it was a wonderful summary of the issues as you'd seen them. But could you give us a little bit of a kind of summary of that shorter piece? What was your particular issue with the degrowth movement and its lack of working class voices?
So Degrowth has a very diverse and global following. It's there. But what makes it unique to other movements, like more decentralized ones like socialism, is that its influence sort of at a global scale is fairly centralized and shaped around people who are white middle class, academically educated, and mostly from the global north. And you have this supremacism of whose voices are heard and visible. And it gives this kind of a degree of credibility to the idea that degrowth won't ever resonate with the broader working class, because there's no working class perspectives, really. You can't have a working class perspective if working class people are not there. And as the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance noted themselves in a really beautiful article, they asked, how did one strand of degrowth become proxy for a much broader whole? And there's been so much criticism about the supremacism of these voices, saying that we need to centre working class, global south voices, other underrepresented voices, and we're just not seeing it reflected. And I know conferences aren't the be-all and end-all, but they're very significant for the movement. Earlier this year, I think it was this year, in the De Gruyter Handbook of Degrowth that was published, there was a chapter by Nathan Barlow, Merle Shulkin, and Christina Plank, where they said that actually the conferences are the movement's dominant strategies, or one of them. And when the working class are absent from one of the dominant strategies, it sends like a really clear message. working class people now, and I've been having conversations with them for about 4 or 5 years. They're like, okay, we're done. we don't want to join something if there's no room for us. So.
Yeah, but again, I had a good look through the WCCA website, and you've got 3 areas that you want to concentrate on in terms of climate action, and you've got educate, agitate, and organise. Could you just give me a kind of brief idea of how you as an individual or WCCA as an organisation kind of attempt to do those things, and what more could people who are active in the climate movement do?
Sure. So I need to first give a nod out because it's an old Labour slogan, but I met somebody called Professor John Barry, who's at Queen's University Belfast last year, and I kept hearing him say that, and I was like, actually, we need to do that because this is what working class people do naturally. So in terms of like educate, for us, it's really centered around advocacy work about working class rights, our cultures and needs, and moving away from seeing working class people as kind of always lacking, because we're often seen through the lens of economic deprivation, but actually, you know, we have so much to give as well. As well as, I think, really raising awareness of how entrenched classism is and what working class environmentalism looks like, as well as our needs and priorities, because as we spoke earlier, the fact that, you know, your economic situation kind of forces you to sort of support things initially. And in terms of agitate, I think if you're talking about the working class and we're challenging these dominant sort of ideas of class politics, ways of doing things, you do have to be prepared to be a little polemical from time to time, and not for its own sake, because it's disingenuous, and it always comes across when it is. But I think just being prepared to be as honest as you need to be in your arguments, and I suppose standing up sort of for yourself and for others when they tell you that you're wrong, and you're like, no. And especially with, you know, when it comes to organising as well, which is our third and final, for us, it's not just for mobilisation, but also to share ideas and expand networks. Because for us, it's really important to recenter what we think of when we think of mobilisation at times, because especially with the working class, not everyone can engage in on the ground stuff. So we're doing a lot of things now with writing, and how that effectively can inspire people. And in the longer term, we are starting relationship building with trade unions, which we'll hopefully start seeing next year in terms of mobilising, but that's more of a longer sort of thing with that.
Kind of looking ahead then, what more do you think the movement can do to encourage more working class voices?
So capabilities allowing, because, you know, even middle class people stretch for time, you know. I would always say, like, to reach out to groups and ask how they can be supported. You know, be it on the ground stuff, you know, skill sharing is absolutely key to cross-class collaboration. And I find that when skills on both sides are shared, that's really when we start seeing the best results, because, you know, middle class people, broadly speaking, tend to have a much better reach to things like media or powerful social networks, whereas working class people are, you know, closer to the trade unions and so on. But also to draw focus when there's a lack of working class presence and perspectives in sort of your own collectives or organisations. If it's lacking, you know, sort of say it and encourage your sort of groups or organisations to sort of reach out to working class people and invite them in, because, and that, you know, change can't happen unless sort of somebody sort of draws focus to it. So definitely.
Well, Emma, thanks so much for spending the time with us to discuss these issues. Hopefully, by having an episode on this, we've helped do a little bit around the, you know, the educate. And we're always keen to have as many working class voices and input and suggestions at our events and on the podcast and within our articles. So thanks very much for joining us in SCOTONOMICS.